Welcome back to That's a Good Word, a podcast designed to assist and equip Christians through advice from people in ministry. If you're blessed by our content, we'd appreciate if you liked and subscribed, and feel free to follow us on any of our social media content as well. We're on Facebook, Instagram, um, and we're also all very active on YouTube as well. So feel free to follow us on any of our social medias. We are honored today to have on Dr. Robert Carter from Creation Ministries International. He's one of the leading researchers and speakers for Creation Ministries. He is has a PhD in marine biology, I believe. He's very much an expert in these areas where I am not. So I am very thankful for him coming on, answer some questions today. Thank you, Dr. Carter, for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Yes, sir. So I guess the first question, you've probably been asked this a lot. Were you always a young Earth creationist?
Absolutely not.
Right. So I mean, growing up, you were an evolutionist. Can you talk about how there had to have been a time of a shift, right?
Growing up, the question never really came up.
Hmm.
Everyone and we always taught evolution in school. We never had any kind of a spiritual discussion at home. I just kind of assumed it was true.
Right.
It was my undergraduate at Georgia Tech when people started challenging me. I said, I really thought those people were crazy that were challenging me.
It was the young Earth guys that were
Yeah, young Earth
challenging
guys
you,
like,
and you were
what?
like,
No, you don't believe in evolution. You don't think Earth's billions of years old? Oh, come on.
yeah,
And I throw something in their face, and most of the time they couldn't answer, but every once in a while someone would have an answer, and I'd have to take a step back and say, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about.
right. I mean, most people, they grow up thinking that science and religion are at odds. It's
Yeah,
just basically the way our education system works,
yeah.
unfortunately. Was there an aha moment for you where it's like, well, and the shift kind of started as like, well, maybe I need to consider, creation, young Earth creation as a model for belief.
Yeah, it was. I was over this girl's house. I kind of liked her, and so her mom was kind of tolerant me, kinda, but her mom was like, I'm not putting up with this boy much longer. So she starts asking me a lot of gospel questions, and I had no idea what any of these answers were. I mean, I'd gone to church growing up, but I knew nothing.
Hmm.
And it turned on to science, of course, and I thought I was in my strong point here, right? And I said, evolution's a fact. And she said, oh, really? I said, yeah. And she goes, give me an example. And I said, Pakicetus. Because I remember the National Geographic had this transitional form between land animals and whales. And she goes, don't you know they just discovered the rest of the skeleton?
Hmm.
And I was horrified. I didn't even know that the picture I had in my head was a cartoon that was based only on a few pieces of a jaw and a few teeth. And it had a full-fledged swimming flippered animal, and the rest of the skeleton showed it was a fully fledged land animal with no transitional features at all. Zero. The inner ear bone is a little bit more like a whale's inner ear bone than other mammals. Okay, but it's not transitional in any sense of the form. And once I figured all that out, I realized I'd probably been lied to,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of things I had to unlearn, and that was probably the beginning domino.
Right. I mean, it had to have been kind of a shock, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
basically spend your whole life, I mean, thinking that maybe there's a compatibility between Christianity and evolution, or just maybe there's not any compatibility at all. And then it's like you got to basically reframe your entire way that you view, I guess, science.
being that I knew nothing about Christianity and I was not in any way, shape, or form a serious young Christian, that there was no controversy in my mind until I started becoming a Christian, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, there's this gigantic thing out there that the Bible completely disagrees with. And so one of these two is going to be right or wrong. I mean,
Mm.
I'm a bit too black and white in my mind. Very, I love logic, and I don't like holding thoughts in my head that don't mesh together. I mean, as a human being, you're always forced to have some of those. You cannot rationalize everything. But as far as the history of the world goes, that should be pretty cut and dry. It's either thousands of years old or billions of years old.
Hmm.
Now, there's nothing in between that. It's one or the other. And it took me a while to finally come around to that thought.
Right. Is when you study, biology and genetics and different sciences, I mean, um, you're a young Earth creationist. Do you start to realize that, hey, I was lied to, and maybe the facts actually lean towards, or even maybe emphatically point towards a young Earth and not an old Earth.
Yeah, but that knowledge came slowly. It was little hints here and there because the way I mean, I was at Georgia Tech, right? It's a technical school. There was no Christianity in any of the classes.
Mm.
There's no even a hint of anything spiritual anywhere, and everything was just naturalism, secularism, and evolution. That was just all kind of wrapped up all together. And so it took a lot of sleuthing, and it was what they weren't saying. It's, you take a class in evolution or a class in chemistry or a class in whatever, and they tell you all the stuff that lines up with evolution, but there's a great deceit. And once I realized that, that's a brilliant way to do it. Give a student 100 facts that are true. This is true, that's true, that's true, this is true, da, 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 and they all support evolution. Therefore, evolution is true.
Mm.
Wait a minute. All the facts you gave me can also be explained by the creationist. Therefore, creation's true according to your own logic. But no, 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 no. So what they're doing is they're avoiding all the hard topics. They don't talk about the origin of life. They don't want to talk about the origin of complexity, the origin of biochemistry, things that aren't going to happen by themselves. They're just not going to. It's like I remember reading Darwin. He's talking about the origin of vision or the origin of eyeballs. And eyeballs are a problem because, first of all, they supposedly evolved a whole bunch of different times. And considering that an octopus has an eyeball and they're related to clams, they're
Mm.
mollusks. So the octopus had to evolve an eyeball very similar to ours, different in some ways, on a completely different path. The eyeballs had to evolve like 17 times. That's tough. But if you had a light sensitive spot that started, you had formed a cup around it, then you might be able to get a better image. If the cup ever closed all the way, you get a pinhole camera, better image. And if you have a lens evolve in front of it, you have an even better image. Except what they ignore is that as the evolution of these things is happening, you're going to get into places where your vision is worse than it was before.
Mm.
So you have the geometry of the eyeball is a problem because you can't just evolve from one point to the other. You go through a point of blindness or blurry vision in between. So you would never evolve to that next spot because in between is worse than where you started with. But that's irrelevant. That's not the hard part. Darwin started with a miracle. He said, "Consider a light sensitive spot." It's like, whoa, wait a minute, Darwin. Consider a miracle of chemistry. Consider something so incredibly implausible, the fact that living things could produce a molecule that could capture a photon, but the molecules that we use to capture photons are destroyed by the photons.
Mm.
I mean, your eyeballs are picking in probably billions of photons per second. Every time a photon hits one of our pigment receptors in our eyeball, it's destroyed. It has to be exported from the cell, remade, and imported again.
Wow.
And you have to
Wow.
take all that and wire it up to a brain, and the brain has to say, "Oh, I have an image," and know what to do with it. It's not just random electrical stimuli. It's actually here comes a shark. I need to swim away. That is a very complicated process. You don't just start with a light sensitive spot unless you want to wave a magic wand of evolution over the problem. And that's essentially what it boils down to. The hardest, most intractable problems in evolution are not brought up in class.
Mm.
And they talk about natural selection, change over time, and things like that. And it's like, whatever. That fits beautifully into the creation model. I mean, God didn't create all species to be static. Our brilliant designer God created things to adapt and change over time. That's part of our model. So everything Darwin said is part of the creation model also. What else you got, Darwin? Wishful thinking.
Mm. Wow. So, and I believe this is a point that many people make is that this is really a clash of two worldviews. Is ultimately what
Yeah.
we have. We have a biblical worldview and then a secularist, atheistic worldview, and that worldview kind of basically makes us look at facts different ways.
Oh, very differently,
If
yeah.
we're starting it, um, so talking, I mean, about these issues that evolutionists kind of avoid. I mean, what does the evolutionist say for the origin of life? I mean, what do they have?
The most common response we see is, "Oh, the origin of life. That's the origin of life. Evolution only talks about things that are alive and can evolve."
Hmm.
Wait a minute. You called it chemical evolution for 100 years.
Mhm.
Darwin speculated about a warm little pond full of with phosphoric salts and things, and I mean, if you don't have an origin of life, where's your origin of life? Did aliens do it? Did God do it? Did Gaia do it? I mean, what are you talking about? If you don't have a mechanistic origin of life, then you're going to talk about religious stuff all of a sudden. And you won't talk about religious stuff. So we try to hold our feet to the fire, saying, no, you need a mechanistic origin of life. And you need chemistry to do it. And you've got nothing in chemistry.
Right. And all these evolutionists, and I don't know how they do it. They have dates for everything. They have dates for how old the Earth they think it is, or dates for different species. How did they come up with the caterpillars certain million years old? The Earth is. How do they even come up with these numbers?
I was just talking to Joel Tay, one of my good friends, who's another speaker. Um, and he reminded me something I'd forgotten about. He says, "Oh yeah, back in the 1800s, they would say dinosaurs. They were like 6 million years ago. And then now they're 65 and more million years ago. But the dates have expanded
Hmm.
for. They've been pretty set for a long while, probably 50 years or so. I'm not sure exactly, but the date has expanded greatly. The age of the Earth has expanded greatly over since the 1800s.
What is their excuse for that? Just more discoveries? Just.
Trying to fit more processes in, they need more time.
Hmm.
The discovery of radiometric decay helped them tremendously. Um, back in the day, um, right before radioactivity was discovered, Lord Kelvin estimated the age of the Earth based on how long it takes the Earth to cool. And he did all his calculations. Says the Earth cannot be millions of years old. It would be a solid rock, but the Earth is still hot inside. That's why you have volcanoes. It's not liquid inside. It's just really, really hot rock that are kind of bendy and twisty because it's so hot, they're soft.
Hmm.
But he said it cannot be millions of years old. And then they discovered radioactivity, which produces a lot of heat. And all of a sudden, they can have a billions of years old Earth as long as they have really long half life radioactive isotopes in the Earth that can break down slowly and keep it hot.
Hmm.
So that was really the great expansion happened end of the 1800s, early 1900s.
Right. There's some things. I mean, evolutionists, man, they have all kind of things to they say about the origin of life for Christianity. I mean, when we're talking about the Genesis one account, I guess the first thing is, and I don't think this is a good argument, but one thing evolutionists always say is, well, if God created people, then who created God? And that's the first thing they always say, which seems like a very elementary type argument. But how do you respond to that?
We just posted a YouTube slash TikTok slash Facebook video on that very topic. It's a short one. So if you go to creation.com, type in who created God, it'll pop right up. Um, and it's a very common question, but the answer is God created time. God is outside of time. If God is eternal, you can't have a starting point.
Hmm.
God calls himself eternal. If God has always existed, there's no creation for God. He must be outside of the space-time continuum that we're trapped in. He knows the future and the past at the same time because he's not like us. We are trapped on what's called the arrow of time. It only goes in one direction. Now, Einstein said it could speed it up or slow it down a little bit. Fine, based on acceleration, but it still only goes in one direction. Even Satan and the fallen angels and demons, they're trapped in this time. They don't know the future. They can't go back and forth in time. Like when Jesus went to cast out the demons of the man in the Gadarene, and they said, "What have you to do with us? Have you come to torment us before our time?" So even the devil is stuck in his linear time. God's not. It's like if you were if you wanted to know the beginning and the end at the same time, the only way you could do it is to take that hour of time and turn it this way.
Yeah.
Because if you look at an arrow end on,
Yeah.
you don't see the arrow. It becomes a point.
Hmm.
And the top and the bottom are lined up with each other. They're at the same time. So God, being a higher dimensional being, is not stuck in our linear time. His time, he can collapse time to a point if he wants to. So it's all simultaneous. He's was never created because he's out of the creation,
Hmm.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a fun topic.
Right.
Yeah, some good articles on creation.com also. Who created God?
Okay.
Type that in our website, it'll come right up.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I definitely would recommend, I mean, any of the resources there.
Thanks.
Creationministries.com. Yeah. Is it Creation Ministries International or just Creation
It's
Ministries?
well, creation.com,
Creation.com.
but it's
Okay.
Creation Ministries International
Okay.
because we are international. We have offices in 7 countries.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I just want to make sure I was saying it right.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when we get more into the origin of life, I mean, the Bible explains that pretty clearly.
Yep.
Um, some things old Earth creationists will say, if we're just going to take the Genesis account and just go straight down it, is they'll say that there is a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. How do you respond to that argument?
First of all, almost no theologians teach that anymore. That was so back in the early 1800s. The scientists are starting to say the Earth is really old.
Hmm.
What do theologians do? They say,
Yeah.
well, hey, we have this idea. Can we rationalize that? Can we bring that into the Bible? And they come up with gap theory, day-age theory, a little later on, the framework hypothesis, all these different ways to put these things together. I don't fault that first generation of theologians for thinking these things. I fault them for holding them for more than 5 minutes. They should have realized that, oh no, that doesn't work because that destroys biblical integrity and this and that and the other. But the gap theory was the Ryrie Study Bible. Most people in the 50s and 60s, was it Ryrie? Was it Dart? Whatever it was. It's before my time, right?
Right.
So I only know from my grandma, my parents' time, but they weren't Bible readers much. So
Right.
anyway,
Right.
there's this idea that um, the that the earth was not formless and void in the beginning, but it became formless and void. So they've added a word that's not in the Hebrew, that it became form. In other words, there was something there, and then it got covered in water. And they call that Lucifer's flood, which of course is not talked about in the Bible. And that's what would have killed off the dinosaurs.
Hmm.
And then God recreated the earth, Garden of Eden, a few thousand years ago. So it's from then on, it's all biblical.
Hmm.
But they're adding this unknown Lucifer's flood that creates a giant layer in the earth, the Cretaceous.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them would be periodic catastrophes. There'd be multiple catastrophes of Earth history that put down each of the major layers. And then the last one would just be the one that killed off the dinosaurs. There's all sorts of different ways to handle that. But, okay, theologians don't teach that anymore. Hardly anyone holds to it. It doesn't work grammatically. It doesn't work in the Hebrew. Plus, that would mean that there's death in the world before Adam sins.
Hmm.
Lots of death. Billions of years of death. And that's a massive theological problem because the Bible says that death is a punishment for sin. I mean, God told Adam, if you eat from that tree, you will definitely die. And that's what happened. Adam ate that, and that's where death and suffering comes from. This is why Jesus had to die on the cross. He had to physically die to pay for sins because God said that death is a punishment for sin. So here's Jesus. He dies in our place. If you have death before that, is death a punishment for sin?
That's a great point. I've never thought about it that way because, yeah, I mean, in the garden you don't have that.
Yeah.
In the garden
And
you
it's
have
not
you
just the
have no
garden.
death.
It's the universe.
Hmm.
Romans 8. All these references to creation. The creation was subject to futility. The whole creation was, that word whole there is katissis. It means everything. Everything, I'm going to paraphrase here, was subject to the burden of sin and is groaning, waiting to be redeemed.
Yeah.
Well, in other words, the creation fell, and we want this restoration, right? Jesus is going to come back. He's going to make all things right. He's going to restore it. But to restore something means that thing gets corrupted.
Hmm.
It had to have fallen into that state of corruption to be redeemed out of it. If sin and if death and suffering have always been there over billions of years, then the earth never changed, never fell into corruption.
Right.
That's a deep theological pool you can wade into there.
That's right. Yeah. And even with the story of Adam and Eve, I mean, Dr. Ronald Marks helped me with this, Professor North Greenville. I mean, basically, if we are, I mean, in Romans 5, Jesus Christ, I mean, Paul says that Jesus brings life in the same way that Adam brought death.
Yes.
To say that Paul was comparing a real event, Jesus, to an analogy, causes also some serious issues. Um, so the Genesis account really is a framework. I mean, it's foundational for the way we understand the rest of Scripture.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, another thing people say, and I don't know how to respond to this, is the people will say that how could there be light before God created the sun, right? Because the sun comes a few verses down,
Hmm.
but God said, "Let there be light." So He creates all these things, and then He creates light. And how could there be vegetation when there's light, basically?
Put on a spacesuit, go into outer space with a flashlight in your hand. Turn on the flashlight. Turn off the flashlight. Throw the flashlight into the sun. The flashlight's gone. What happens to the light from that flashlight?
Travel travel to the earth, right?
Well, whatever way you pointed it, it'll go on forever.
Hmm.
You don't need a light source for light. The light source is gone. You turn the flashlight off, you destroy it, or you just never turn it on again, the light will keep going. There's no light source necessary. Once the light is in there, you don't need a sun for it. So God could have created the light easily. A lot of people say that the light would have been the Shekinah glory, like what lit up Moses' face that everyone was afraid of, just the glowing glory of God, maybe hovering over the waters or out in outer space. Who knows? It could be anything. The whole universe could be pulsing with light for whatever. See, we know when God created, we know the order of events. We don't know a lot of details, and we don't know how God did it. He did not tell us the physics of creation.
Hmm.
And there's tons of ways to have light without a sun.
Right, right. Yeah, sometimes I guess people like me, like a layman, would associate light with sun. I mean, that's the only
Yeah,
way I can think
of
of it.
course.
But
And that's natural. But you think through it, oh yeah, that's not as big as an objection as I thought it might be.
right, right, definitely. Um, Another thing people say, I know I'm just going through basically a bunch of arguments, but I believe
Right?
this is good, important to help equip Christians, to answer these kind of questions. People say, well, those days in Genesis aren't literal 24-hour days; they're figurative days that could have been thousands of years. Who
Yeah, the
knows?
old day age theory. Right? That's
Right.
my first approach to this was to adopt that. I didn't know it had a technical term, the day age theory, but that was my first attempt to rationalize deep time and biblical time.
Hmm.
Took me a while to realize it doesn't work because you can't get plants millions of years before you get a sun
Hmm.
because the plants are created on the day before the sun is created. Oh, and I mean, if you were to express in Hebrew a series of events on consecutive days, you would write it just like it's written in Genesis 1.
Yeah.
That's exactly how you construct it.
Yeah.
There's so many ways to express long periods of time in Hebrew. Most of them are forward in time. But God also says, remember in the past. But, you know, he makes promises to Abraham, he makes promises to King David, and lots of, basically eternal into the future, whatever promises. There's a lot of ways to express long periods of time in Hebrew. None of them are used in Genesis 1.
Hmm.
If there was even a hint of it, I could drive a truck through that gap and add billions of years. But it's not there. I mean, if God wanted to express that he created the universe in 6 consecutive light dark cycles. And I say that because I don't know the first couple of days are exactly 24 hours. There was no sun.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know how long those days were. I assume they're about 24 hours, but I'm not going to, go down to the millisecond and say, yeah, that's exactly the same because there's no sun yet.
Yeah.
But there's a period of light, a period of dark, period of light, period of dark, period of dark. Oh, and then all of a sudden the sun appears. So the day age theory is for some people an honest approach. For me, I was being honest. I was trying to figure it out, but it doesn't work. It's like when God created the universe, he intentionally did the order of events to thwart all naturalistic explanations.
Hmm.
It just
Yeah.
the timeline's wrong.
Yeah.
It's all messed up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think many times what you have to do, if to take the evolutionist perspective and try to match it, you have to kind of read science into the Bible more than the other way
Yeah.
around. And the Bible should be our foundational text. I mean,
Yeah.
is our best evidence? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but it's not a science textbook.
Hmm. Right.
The purpose of the Bible is to point us to Jesus Christ, tell us how to be saved. It's not to explain plate tectonics or the time of travel of light across the universe.
Hmm.
Now, it should not be wrong in science, but it doesn't give us descriptive science. It's just every once in a while it makes a scientific statement that has to be true, um, but it's really light on details.
Hmm.
So all God gave us was this basic framework of creation, and then we can fill in the rest. And so we wrestle and we argue and we write models and get papers, and then paper gets contradicted by somebody else because that's how science progresses.
Hmm.
Like the biggest contention probably right now is the flood post flood boundary. Like where did the flood end in the geologic record? There's some very different opinions on that in our camp. Or how do you explain light traveling across the universe in only thousands of years? Well, there's 4 or 5 completely different ideas that all seem to solve the problem, but they're all very different from one another. Which one of them is the right one? Oh, I don't know. And we argue about it, but it's fun.
Right.
It's part of the. It's just like in theology. I mean, you sit down with some idea in the scriptures and you start arguing about it, right? And it's fun. People have very different ideas and it come to very different conclusions, but they're still being faithful to the text.
Hmm. Yeah. So, when we get that, and we're going to talk a little bit about, the flood, and kind of the biology of that, and all those things. But
Okay.
one thing I know that you worked a lot on is genetics, and saw some videos on that I really enjoyed. Um, Speaking specifically, I mean, like for a layman like me who doesn't really understand genetics really well at all, how do genetics point us to evidence of God and the God of the Bible?
We have to take the study of DNA carefully because most all the information has been brought to us through an evolutionary filter. And if you read anything about it, it just assumes evolution is true, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the things that we see that the evolutionists would claim as evidence for evolution is also fits perfectly well in the creation model. Mutation, natural selection, a little bit of change over time. That's fine. I totally accept that. So we got to get beyond that into the underlying stuff. And like I know that humans and chimpanzees are very similar genetically. That is true. We're not vastly different. We're very similar. But they kind of look like us and they kind of act like us and they eat all the same foods we do. And if we weren't smart enough to invent clothing and air conditioning, things like that, we would still be living in the rainforest naked with them.
Hmm.
But we're more intelligent, so we've expanded our bounds and they're still stuck in the same place because they're still, basically dumb as a box of rocks and we can fly to the moon. But so there is that similarity there, and that is true. It's just a fact. You can't, God could have created us as different as he created us from rutabagas,
Hmm.
but he didn't. He created us similar to chimpanzees.
Right.
Okay. But the question is, how did humans get so intelligent when we've had the same amount of time?
Hmm.
They say we
Right.
separated from chimpanzees 6 million years, 7 million years ago. Um, we've had the same amount of mutations, same amount of natural selection, same environmental changes. Even in their model, not my model, but just assuming all that stuff is true, how come they haven't changed? They're essentially the same as they would consider our common ancestor to be. They're no more intelligent. They're metabolically, their brain, and they didn't go anywhere.
Right.
That's bizarre. But then when you look at the genetics, wait a minute. There's no reason in evolution to assume that all people can be traced back to one man or all people can trace back to one female. There's no reason for that at all. The evolutionists discovered this. They call her mitochondrial Eve, and they call him Y chromosome Adam. There's one female and one male ancestor for everyone on Earth today. Now they say, oh, they didn't even live at the same time. It was just random chance this person happened to appear, and then that mitochondria or that Y chromosome replaced all the other ones in the entire world over time, just by dumb luck. Now, that can happen mathematically in a really small population.
Right.
It's not going to happen in a large population or populations divided up into little subpopulations. So it can happen. So they have this African bottleneck idea. They say, oh, humanity was reduced to an effective population size of about 10,000 people. And that's where mitochondrial leave and Y chromosome atom just randomly appeared in that tiny little population, just out of chance. But the Bible demands that there's only one male and one female ancestor of all humanity. Right? Biblically, that's Adam and Eve, and they did live at the same time. That's a
Right.
starting point scripturally, and the
Right.
evolutionists go out and they figure it out. Hey, thank you much. That's ours. You can go play with something else now. But they put them, 200,000 years ago,
Yeah.
not 6,000 years ago, because they're trying to minimize the mutation rate. They're deliberately slowing the mutation rate down as much as possible so that Adam and Eve would be further in the past.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man. So, yeah, once again, you see the example of them basically changing the narrative
Yeah.
in a sort of way. One thing that you've worked a lot on is with genetics and then population over time. And I know a lot of believers are curious about this. I mean, you think about what was the population when the flood happens, and then you have another section where you have the flood, and then you have all the way to the Tower of Babel. How many people are there? And then you have how in the world do we get to 8 billion people over 4,500 years
Yeah.
since the flood? I mean
Yeah.
that's something that's always fascinated me. So how do we get to this number?
So one of my friends and I, we wrote a paper for our journal Creation, which is now on creation.com, about human population growth. We did some computer modeling of the question. The other question is, how do you get 2 or 3 million Israelites coming out of Egypt when only 70 went into Egypt?
Yeah, and it wasn't, how long was it? It wasn't too long. I mean, 200.
Well, we CMI just published a long series of articles, and we worked for months on this, on how long the Israelites were in Egypt.
Right.
And
Because there's a lot of debate on
there's
it.
a lot of debate, but all the evidence put together, we concluded it was 215 years,
Wow.
not 430 years.
Wow.
Some people assume it's 430, some people assume it's 215.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bit much for this podcast right now.
Right.
But our long articles on creation.com about the Egyptian sojourn. But if it's only 215 years, how do you get millions of people coming out of Egypt if only 70 went into Egypt? Well, the answer is, if you get married about age 20 and you have children every 2 years until you're about age 30 or 40, you get 2 million people. Boom. Easy. Right. But, that does assume a few things about population growth. But also, there's another question people don't realize. When Abraham went to rescue Lot, he had a lot of men in his household. He had, 318 or something like that? Men born in his household who are old enough to wield the sword.
Wow.
So that means there's also old people and there's also young people. He probably had a household of about 1,000 people. If you have 300 warrior-aged men in your household.
Oh my goodness.
Well, he hadn't had any children yet.
Right.
Pretty soon after that, the covenant of circumcision is enacted. Every male in Abraham's household had to be circumcised. Isaac inherits that household. And Isaac is a pretty significant chieftain at the time. I mean, he's wrestling with Abimelech down in southern Israel there because there's not enough room for them.
Right.
Well, I mean, he's got 2 little boys and he's got a large household. And then Jacob inherits that household. When Jacob and his family go to Egypt, did they leave the long-term family servants, most of whom would be married into the family by then, and all the men of whom are circumcised, to die of starvation in the wilderness during the drought? Or did they take that household with them?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you start off with more than 70, how do you get 2.5 million people 215 years later? It's trivial. If there's 10,000 people that came in, no problem at all. If there's 1,000 people, pretty easy. If there's 70 people, you can still do it under the right conditions. But if they're there for 430 years, then there's no problem at all. From 70, you can have way more than 2 million people in 400 years.
Right. In the 450 years post-flood, I mean, does it make sense to have 8 billion from however many are in? I mean, you have Noah and all those and his sons. I mean, can we get to 8 billion?
If you take Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives, get rid of Noah and his wife, just those 6 people, 3 founding couples. You start with 6 people. If you double the population every 150 years, you'll arrive at 8 billion people today.
Wow.
So 150 years after the flood, there's 12 people.
So it fits perfectly within the model.
300 years after the flood, there's only 24 people. That's such a ridiculously slow population growth.
Yeah.
Human populations grow really fast. If there's food and there's not a war and there's not an epidemic, human populations explode. So our problem is not saying how do we have as many as 8 billion people? The problem is saying, why are there only 8 billion people?
Mm.
There should be a lot more than that, but because of wars and starvation, disease, there's a lot less people than there could be.
Right. So following this line, I believe Tower of Babel, we're looking thousands of people, give or take.
Depends on when it was.
Right. I mean, the Tower of Babel story is fascinating.
Yeah.
It seems that they were I mean, we had this idea that we're the most intelligent people, and then nobody before us was any intelligent. Those ancient people were just dumb and everything, which is I believe it's probably a false view. I mean, obviously these individuals were intelligent. They were building a tower big enough to where God found it
Yes.
pretty, you know, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So what's the situation there? I mean, is there just thousands of people working together all in one accord? Is there a big population?
I don't know the population size because I'm not sure when it happened. I tend to believe that it happened when Peleg was born, but it's only 5 generations after the flood. There's not 1 million people yet,
Right.
and that would be 98 years after the flood. Now he lived for 215 or something like that years. So if he was named Division, his name means division. If he was named Division sometime during his lifetime, I mean, Abraham got a new name, Jacob got a new name, right? Maybe he got a new name.
Right.
Then we've got up to 300 years for the Tower of Babel event to happen after the flood. There could be tens of thousands of people. I don't expect 1 million people yet. Some people argue that, oh no, that's the division of land, not division of the people by. And some people say, no, it's plate tectonics. That's when a continent split. No,
Right.
not true.
Right.
Because that means that half the fossil record has to happen after the Tower of Babel. No. It's a good thought, but it doesn't work that way.
Right.
But I don't know how many people were at the Tower of Babel.
Right.
But
the division is dealing more with. The division was not with land; it was with the people being scattered. And then it seems that with all these groups, I mean, the groups could have rapidly expanded in population growth.
Yeah, each little group would have been expanded on their own. Some of them didn't. Some of them did.
Right.
And the ones that did took over. Yeah. For instance, the first people that got up to Europe and Asia, we call them Neanderthals. They're human beings. They're intelligent. They painted in caves. They made musical instruments. They had a diverse diet. They sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to islands that are never connected to the mainland, and they had habitations there. And they were seafarers and fishermen, and they had medicine. I mean, not the Neanderthals that I grew up with, right? These are intelligent people.
Yeah.
But they never achieved a large population size. And they lived from Spain to all the way to, the border of China, Mongolia, and Russia. That's a huge area. Yeah. And maybe they had at most 5,000 of them alive at any time.
Wow. I mean, they just died out?
They inbred. They inbred like crazy because the population density was so low. If you found a Neanderthal, you married her. Right. I mean, and sometimes it was your sister. And so now we're able to pull DNA out of their bones. It's shocking how inbred they were. But they're living in this marginal environment in the middle of Europe and Asia during and after the Ice Age. And what happens? Well, people who had a larger population moved into that area afterwards, and they displaced those people, the Neanderthals. But people are people, and they intermarried with them. And that's why you and I have Neanderthal DNA. They're partly our ancestors.
Right.
But let's go back a second. There's some urban myths here about the Tower of Babel account that most people have in their mind. And I just had this thing that really bugs me. The influence of Sir Leonard Woolley, archaeologist, 1920s, 1930s. He's digging in southeast Mesopotamia at a city called Ur.
Hmm.
And he finds a ziggurat. And he finds this flood deposit. And he claims that this entire Genesis account, first couple chapters of Genesis, come from this Mesopotamian, southeast Mesopotamian context. And Abraham was just a guy who lived during this period when Ur was this major city. And the flood was local.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wait a minute. First of all, that's too late in history. The Tower of Babel was earlier than that. The Tower of Babel, the Bible does not say it was a ziggurat. In fact, the Bible says the Tower of Babel was clay that they baked and covered in tar. Ziggurats are just sun-dried mud bricks. They're not kiln fired.
Right.
So something very different happening here. But also we have the city named Ur. So we have a city named Ur, way down there in southeast Iraq. But the Bible never calls it Ur. It always calls it Ur of the Chaldeans. Who are the Chaldeans? Nebuchadnezzar is called the Chaldean. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, started the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Oh, it sounds like Babel, right? Babylon, Babel. No. Very different words in the original languages. But the Chaldeans aren't from southeast Iraq, where Nebuchadnezzar had his capital. Job had a problem. The Chaldeans came and raided. Wait, who? Job lived up in northwest Syria, the other end of the Fertile Crescent, the other end of Mesopotamia. In fact, when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, Chaldean homeland is up in Syria. It wasn't until the time after King David, they invaded southwards and took over and started the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They didn't even live anywhere near Ur when Sir Leonard Woolley said, this is Abraham's Ur. That's not Chaldean country.
Wow.
They're way up in the southeast, but there's a city called Haran. This is where Terah died, Abraham's father. After they left Ur, they went to Haran. That's where Terah died. Abraham leaves there. When he tells his servant, hey, servant, I want you to go find a wife for my son, Isaac. Go to my family homeland. Where does he send him? Haran. Not southeast Mesopotamia, northwest Mesopotamia. Far away. And then when Jacob flees from his brother, he goes to Haran again. And Haran is an amazing city because you're sitting there, and just to the northwest is a city called Urfa, and that's Chaldean country. Oh, so I think Sir Leonard Woolley and other people who don't really believe the Bible gave us a false picture, and so people have the ziggurat in their head, and what that does, it causes a conflict because there's a lot of time before those ziggurats are built. You have the whole Ubaid period. And if you put Abraham in there, then the earth is older than the Bible says it is. So instead, no, the Ubaid period, that's the first people that started to settle in Mesopotamia after the Tower of Babel.
Right.
And Abraham's not living anywhere near there. He's far away in a city right near another city called Urfa, which is Chaldean country. And the other strange thing, the oldest archaeology that we know of is this really weird place. It's called Göbekli Tepe. So if you look at where Mount Ararat is and all the hills of Turkey, when you go south, all of a sudden you hit the Mesopotamian plain. Just flat, muddy expanse, dry and dusty. And then there's mountains north of that.
Right.
Haran is sitting there in a valley and is looking at those hills. It's in a flat expanse. Urfa is in the hills a little bit to the west, but just north of Haran is Göbekli Tepe, sitting on the edge of the last hill, looking down at Haran. And it's this Stonehenge-like place that's much more complicated and bigger than Stonehenge. But instead of lifting up heavy rocks, making T's, they carved them in the shape of a T.
Wow.
And hauled them, and instead of being flat, there's three-dimensional animals carved in those rocks. It's just amazing, amazing, amazing place. And the evolutionists are like, these people weren't even farmers yet. They're just hunter-gatherer people. Hunter-gatherers don't have central authorities, and they don't have cities, and they can't get together to make monumental projects. Where'd this thing come from? And it just so happens to be looking down at one of the most important early biblical cities. So Abraham would have known it was there.
Wow.
It might have been buried by that time because it was deliberately buried.
Wow.
No one knows why.
Yeah.
But this is an early post-flood something that is mystifying us and is wrapped up in a whole early Genesis account. It's really cool.
That's really cool. Yeah. I mean, listen, I it's fascinating to think about. Obviously, we can never know fully, but I mean, pre-Babel or even pre-flood, it seems like the people were pretty intelligent. That I mean, maybe not in the same ways we were, but you think about pyramids, and people have different dates of when they think the pyramids were built, but
The
different.
pyramid's post-flood, though.
Pyramid was post-flood.
Yeah,
Okay.
it has to be.
Okay. Okay.
The pyramid couldn't survive the flood.
Okay. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And plus, they're built out of flood
Would it be
deposited rocks.
pre-Babel or post-Babel? Probably, likely.
Post-Babel. But if Babel's only 100 years after the flood, you still have a few centuries before you have to start building pyramids.
Okay. Right. But even like Babel, I mean, these people had to have been pretty intelligent to do something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but what technology does the Bible describe? Before the flood,
Right.
what's the technologies that we have in Genesis? Herders, people living in tents, workers in bronze. They had precious gold,
Right. Okay.
musical instruments. I think that's it.
Hmm.
After the flood, what's the technology that is described? Oh, they could make bricks and bake them and cover them with pitch.
Hmm.
Oh, and no one knew how to build a large ship.
Right.
And he covered it in pitch inside and out. And there's another thing. Some people are like, oh, you can't build a wooden ship that big. Yeah, you can. The Chinese in the 1600s were building ships the size and shape of Noah's Ark. They had a flat
Wow.
bottom because junks have flat bottoms.
Right.
And they sailed them at least as far as Madagascar.
Wow.
They sailed them across the open ocean.
Right.
And the thing about a sailing ship is the weak point is the mast. That is you try to put a big pole in the middle of a ship, you create all sorts of problems, especially in a storm. And ships can break in half and da 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 da. Noah's Ark did not have any masts.
Hmm.
So not only is it possible to build a ship that big and an ocean-going ship that big, and we know it, it didn't even matter. His ship was safer than anything that has a mast because it wasn't a sailing ship.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. That's. I mean, thinking about the flood, that's also a fascinating story. There is a common theme amongst evolutionists, old earthers that will say that the flood was local and it wasn't a worldwide flood. Not everybody says that, but some people will say this is a local flood. It's just scientifically, what are some evidences we have of a worldwide flood?
Besides the billions of dead things laid
Right.
down in rocks deposited by water
Right.
all over the earth,
Right.
there's so much evidence. But most of the fossil record is clams.
Hmm.
It's shellfish, crinoids, which are a type of starfish, things like that. There's most of the fossil record is marine based,
Okay.
which shouldn't be too big a surprise because the flood was water based.
Right.
The oceans came up onto the land.
Right.
And it's bizarre because continents today are pretty high above sea level,
Mm-hmm.
but all the continents have been covered in water for most of evolutionary history in their model. That's very strange. They float. Continents are light rocks, so they float on the heavier hot rocks underneath.
Mm-hmm.
How do they go underwater all the time?
Hmm.
So, well, it's because of the flood. And when you look at the flood, Dr. Tim Clary at the Institute for Creation Research, he's done most of the work on this, and it's amazing. For the first time ever, someone's mapping the world's geological record.
Wow.
No one's ever done that before.
Wow.
And so he's a petroleum geologist, and he knew how to do it, and it's all public information, but I never would have known it was there. He's looking at all these drilling records from all these petroleum companies that are now public. And they'll drill it here, and they've drilled all over every continent, all over the world, and in oceans too. And you can see, okay, that sandstone right there is also here in Nebraska. Oh, it's also in Kansas. It's also in Missouri. Oh, it's also in Georgia. Oh, yeah, that's the one that outcrops in Grand Canyon. And all of a sudden, you're talking about a sandstone layer that covers the continent and is proportionally thinner than a sheet of paper.
Hmm.
It's only a few hundred feet thick, but it's tens of thousands of square miles in extent. And it's one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And you have limestone, huge limestone deposits. Limestone's not, it's not forming anywhere in the world today.
Hmm.
Well, calcium carbonate doesn't just fall out of the water anywhere. There's a couple of places like in the Gulf of Oman where it's really hot water, and then like a tide pool or something can dry out and kind of can calcify on there. But that's not the same chemistry as we see in like the state of Florida. I had a professor once in graduate school, PhD level marine biology
Yeah.
course. He said, "Oh, let's just face it, Florida's one big coral reef." And I raised my hand. I said, "Oh no, it's not." He said, "What?" I said, "Florida is a mile thick of chemically deposited limestone.
Hmm.
On top of that, a thin crust of bryozoans and corals exists on the southern end, called the Florida Keys. The bryozoan goes up into Palm Beach area, maybe that far
Yeah.
north. The rest is just like at Grand Canyon. It's chemically deposited rock that's not forming anywhere in the world today." So the phrase, "the present is the key to the past."
Right.
Yeah, it is. And something different must have happened in the past because it's not happening today.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, I mean, when I went very young, went to the Grand Canyon. I mean, you see something like that, it seems that like, okay, something's going on here that couldn't have taken place. I mean, yeah, even over millions of years, I don't think how could you explain that taking place? And
But it looks old. And if you think that things happen slowly in geology, it would have taken millions of years.
Mhm.
So most people don't struggle with it until you realize that, hey, you see that white band near the top, and just under that's kind of a brown band. Uh, there's a 300 million year gap in that between the top one and the bottom one in their model, but they're sitting perfectly flat, one on top of the other.
Hmm.
That was 300 million years where the lower surface actually was exposed to the air, and it's still flat as a pancake. And it's like someone cut it with a knife and laid down the other one on top of it. Why? Because there's not 300 million years. If you just measure the amount of mud coming out the Mississippi River, the entire continent will be eroded to sea level in less than 15 million years. The whole continent. So how could you have a perfectly flat surface lasting for millions of years before another surface is deposited on top of that? And there's a 100 million year gap down toward the bottom near the Great Unconformity. They say it's like a 1.2 billion year gap.
Wow.
Most of the time in a fossil record is in the gaps.
Hmm.
And once you realize that, you're like, wait a second. You mean most of the time is in those flat spots? Yeah, almost all the time's in the flat spots, and there's a period of sediment accumulating for a while. They'll say it's millions of years, fine. But still, how do you explain those flat gaps that we see all over the world and are on full display at Grand Canyon?
Hmm.
The time is not there.
Right. God has given us the evidence, it seems, in nature itself sometimes.
Yeah, but if you discount God and discount any catastrophe, then the only thing you have left is slow and gradual natural processes.
Hmm.
And that's exactly where the millions of years idea comes from.
Right.
Just the assumption that it's slow and gradual.
Right. You've given us so much scientific evidence that there is for the scriptures being true, being accurate, and the clear reading of them. If you're having a discussion with a critic, and they're having trouble with the scientific evidences, is there one thing that you always go to, scientific evidence that you believe may be the best evidence for creation, for young Earth?
Um, there's not necessarily because every conversation is different and no conversation ever goes the way I expect it to.
Hmm.
And they'll raise a question that's like, why are you talking about that? And very often it's something outside their field of expertise. Because most scientists, they know their struggles,
Right.
but they think the other guy's got it all worked out.
Hmm.
I have multiple people, like when I was a clandestine creationist in graduate school, I remember one guy said, "Oh yeah, this guy's got it all figured out." Literally, that was his phrase, and he was struggling with this stuff that he's working on. I was like,
Yeah.
So it depends. I love talking about Adam and Eve, and it's right there in genetic data.
Hmm.
I love talking about the origin of life, the origin, DNA. DNA is not going to form in any naturalistic process. It's going to self-destruct very quickly, and yet here we are. Um,
You talk about with the eyes. I mean, is that kind of with every part? I mean, every part of the body. The likelihood seems impossible that you could have the DNA, the complexity of the DNA, the complexity of the way we work as humans seems almost impossible to have taken place.
but
Um,
if evolution happened, you might be able to explain humans evolving from monkeys.
hmm, okay,
So instead of that, I go to the other end. Let's talk about where it started, because
right,
that's what they can't explain.
right,
Like, even if you had, I love that at the end of our Evolution's Achilles Heels movie, Dr. John Sanford, a world famous geneticist, he basically said, I remember when he said this, when he got him on camera, I said, that was brilliant. I've never thought of this. He said, I will give the evolutionist proteins, sugars, DNA. I'll give them membranes. I'll give them cells with all the stuff inside it. I'll even give them millions of years. They're still not going to get life because life needs information.
hmm,
DNA is not just a chemical, it's a chemical that has the instruction set to maintain and make living things. And that instruction set is not going to come out of random anything. So even if they had all the parts, you're not going to get life. That was brilliant. In fact, we've done this experiment billions of times in human history.
hmm,
Every time we can something and put it on a shelf, all the parts of living things are there
really,
at a high concentration, and they're pure, and it was all right there. And yet, if anything ever started growing in that can, you just assume it's a contamination, because it is. It's a mold that got in there. You didn't preserve it properly or whatever. But every time you can anything, that's an origin of life experiment.
hmm,
And life is never going to originate that way, even though all the chemicals are right necessarily there.
wow, never thought about it like that. That's fascinating. Speaking about Adam and Eve, what in that evidence that you enjoy talking about, one thing I hear people say is they'll talk about Adam and Eve being historical, Adam and Eve being fictional, that basically you have it's that's more the figurative stuff, and then after chapter 3 you have all the literal stuff. um when you talk about Adam and Eve, just how important is them being real people, the first people, how important is that, and then where's the evidence of that?
Well, theologically, the Bible says that we died in Adam. He is our head. We're cursed with sin because our head fell into sin.
Hmm.
If there's no Adam, you can't explain where sin came from, what the penalty for sin is. The parallel to that is Jesus. He's our head, he's our representative because he lived a sinless life. He put that onto us. He died in our place, took in the death that we deserved, right? Well, without Adam, how do you even explain that?
Hmm.
Where does sin come from? Why is there suffering and death in the world if Adam wasn't real? The Bible says
Right,
God set up the world with no suffering and no death.
right.
So it's a giant contradiction. It's not just a little contradiction. It's something that runs throughout the entire Scripture. The New Testament, even look at the end of the Bible. We have the Book of Revelation. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things are passed away. It's in Revelation 21. What former things? It's all the junk we got from Adam.
Hmm.
And then it
Yeah,
says, and there's no more curse.
yeah.
Wait a minute. That's from Genesis. And then the tree of life reappears. Wait a minute. That's definitely from Genesis. It's like
Yeah,
the end of the Bible is fixing the problem set up on the beginning of the Bible. And if the beginning isn't real, then the theology doesn't make sense all the way through.
hmm,
So theologically, this is why Adam is important.
yeah,
Historically, God could have done it any way he wanted. He could have created over billions of years if he so chose. But he didn't say that. He said he did it this way. And so we just got to take it. That's how we did it. Okay, that's how we did it. He could have done it any
right.
way he wants.
Yeah,
Because when you talk about a creator, all things are possible.
right. That's right.
I mean, in one sense, Jesus being God could have chose any means of salvation he wanted. He could have come down to earth and said, hey, y'all, your sins are forgiven. Have a nice day. And gone back up to heaven. Except he couldn't do that because he promised Adam that sin equals death.
Hmm.
So the only way to pay for sins was to die. But our death isn't good enough because we're not pure. We're not sin-free. We're
Yeah.
not the unblemished lamb.
Amen.
It took the sin-free, unblemished lamb to die in our place, and God said, "Okay, I'll accept that sacrifice." And Jesus said, "Okay, and all these are mine. They're coming with me." God said, "Okay." So yeah, there's a lot of theology here.
Right.
And without that Adam being real, I yeah, that theology goes off a cliff.
Right. Right. Amen. Well, Dr. Carter, we're running up on time here. I hate it, but I really appreciate you coming on today to talk about this.
You're welcome.
I personally learned a lot. I know our listeners will as well, and be
Hope so.
edified by it. So thank you for doing this. I hope
Welcome.
to get you back up to Greenville soon. Not too far, being in Atlanta. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for being on the show today. Is there anything else you want to discuss before we head out here?
I just say point people to our website again, creation.com.
Hmm. Yes,
Tons of
sir.
answers to lots of questions.
Yes, sir. We'll put a link in the description
Thank you.
for our YouTube channel so you can get there and access any of the articles and many, many helpful resources to understanding the answers to these difficult questions that maybe we covered and you want to go more in depth or that maybe we didn't get to look at that and just really would recommend those resources. So, Dr. Carter, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, I'm Wilson Paris, and that's a good word.